Let's get it. Okay. Yeah, like I said, I've titled this presentation "A History of South Korea's Industrialization Program," which is quite an interesting one, beginning with, you know. So I'll go down here. The first slide, how do we tell what is the right way? There are so many countries today that are still struggling to get there, to be on it, to get off their knees economically and socially. And South Korea continues to be like a model, one of the few countries that has been able to get to that point. So the question is, what is it that has made South Korea what it is? But if you look at the history, it also reminds me of a quote from Shakespeare's book, The Merchant of Venice, where Portia says that if to do were as easy as to know what to do, then churches would have been, then chapels would have been filled, and little homes would have become mansions. That tells you that it's not just a question of knowing, it's not just a question of doing, but knowing what to do. So that has been the challenge and the experience of this. Experience of South Korea's industrialization process. So that's what I'll be chronicling and discussing. That's what we chronicle in the book, and that's what I'll try to present to you in the few minutes that we have allocated for this presentation. Yes. Yeah, right away I would want to just give you a sense of what this book really covers so that you get a sense of where we are, what the whole process has been about. There's an interesting point. The first thing I need to make very clear that this book continues a very interesting trend of revisionist history in South Korea. Not just South Korea, most parts of Northeast Asia. History remains a very contentious issue. Probably brings to mind what James Joyce, the Irish poet, said that, history is a nightmare that I'm trying to wake up from. So it remains a very polarizing subject. Depends on which part of the political spectrum you are. There have been attempts every now and then to interpret historical events based on, ideological leanings here and there. So I would immediately be quick to point out that this book is by no means an it does not by any means claim to present an objective, independent opinion. It takes a particular stand, which is part of the ongoing revisionist position about what is it that has made this country what it is. There are different views, so this is just one strand of it. So it doesn't claim in any way to be the final authoritative position on the key issues. And in lieu with that, I would also want to emphasize that yes, the book hasn't relied on important primary sources. A lot of it has been secondary sources and individual accounts of events and situations and contexts. So that in itself presents some degree of subjectivity in terms of how you would perceive the issues that have been raised and highlighted in the book. So yes, I would want that to be taken you to take full note of that as we go down this presentation. And moreover, it tries to present not just the historical, it's not a chronology of the historical events, but it's been selective in terms of trying to provide context for each of the situations. What were the issues that went in? What were the competing narratives? At what point? What were the dilemmatic situations that had to be, that compelled the decisions that were made, the issues that were brought up at different points, successes and failures. And to a great extent, we would also like to look at it as this book has been, is more also, there's been a lot of emphasis on the successful elements, a great deal of the success elements. And there hasn't been much in terms of what are the constraints, the areas, important areas of the setbacks that have been encountered during, the whole industrialization process or the, economic development process. One glaring example, which probably most readers might at some point have to contend with, is the fact that, the book barely touches on one of the major issues that confronted the Korean economy, which was the 1997 Asian financial crisis and the devastating impact it had on the economy. It kind of, in many ways, did undo many of the initial logical underpinnings upon which the industrialization process was premised. So there had to be reinventions from major reforms had to take place and undo many of the issues that were raised that have been discussed in this book. But for some reason, the lead author would prefer to focus entirely on the positives. So I'm just putting all of these things in terms of making you get a sense of the context under which, we had to work and get this done. Now, having said that, I'll now give you an outline of the sort of presentation I'll be giving. So I've broadly divided into three categories. We have the initial conditions, the leadership, and the outcome. So in the initial conditions, we'll try to look at what is it that were the conditions under which the modern state, the modern South Korea was created, the conditions that came up that gave rise to it. And we look at the role of leadership also. What was it about leadership that that played a critical role in determining the direction in which the country was to go, and that ultimately leads us to the outcome, the choices that were made and the outcomes that have come up as a result of that. And on the question of the leadership, I would also want to put in case, just slightly add one more thing. South Korea has been in the news lately for all the wrong reasons in terms of the political crisis that's engulfed the country in the last 4 or 5 months. And I must add that South Korean politics, like sausage making, is the closer you get to it, the less attractive you find it. So we haven't been able, the book hasn't, for strategic purposes, hasn't covered the broad spectrum of the leadership paradigm. It's specifically just focused, since I try to say that this deals with context. So it just deals with the context of two leaders, which is first prime president of South Korea, Syngman Rhee, and the longest serving president, which was Park Chung-hee, in fact, under whose watch the industrialization actually was initiated, implemented, and consolidated. So those are the two leaders that have been focused. We place a lot of focus on in the book. All right, so I'll start with the initial conditions now. Let's look at it. You'll understand that in many cases, if you want to understand the history of South Korea, needs to be looked at within the broader geopolitical history of the 20th century, mid-20th century, and the ideological cleavages that divided the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc. And I would like to call South Korea a child of the Cold War. So yes, coming out of liberation under Imperial Japan. This was a basket case. It was an incredibly, it was a state that lacked many of the fundamentals to be able to assert itself as what you call a sovereign state. And that was further complicated by the presence of occupation forces, that divided the entire Korean peninsula. So it was not a country that had any viability. It wasn't viable. It was an artificial construct, a construct that was put in place based on the whims and caprices of the political forces of the mid-20th century. So yes, it was a very precarious economic condition, that a very precarious state in which the country was born. Moreover, if you look at it within the context of the Korean War and the conflict issues that arose and the continued heavy militarization of the Korean Peninsula, you would get to understand that this was definitely a very, very fragile country. Think of the likes of states like Somalia. Well, Somalia might be another, but you look at Afghanistan in terms of the level of fragility, as the government of the governments in Afghanistan tried to, preside over a non-existent state. It was almost the same with the kind of condition here in South Korea. And I would also like to look at it as, if you look at it, it was a complete basket case. First of all, you'd have to put it in this way, a basket case, because economically, when the Korean Peninsula was divided, the southern half was far more deprived and less resourced than the northern part. For strategic reasons, Imperial Japan placed many of the strategic industry, the industrial heartland of the Korean Peninsula happened to be in the northern half. And the southern part was largely was an agricultural terrain with huge mountains and very few access to arable land to engage in real commercial scale agriculture.